Hello, STEM Nation. Jeff here, and welcome to episode number 92 of STEM on Fire, where we interview practicing professionals in the area of science, technology, engineering, and math to help guide students interested in STEM careers. If you like what you hear, please share it with a friend. Now let's get fired up today with our guest, Michael, and I hope our chat will help ignite your passion towards a STEM career. Michael earned a PhD in chemical engineering from the University of Texas at Austin and is a professor at NC State, or North Carolina State. And looking at his LinkedIn profile, I'm kind of excited to have him on here because he's got expertise in nano fabrication, liquid metal, and stretchable electronics, which is things I know nothing about. So welcome to the show, Michael. Fill in any gaps and share a bit of your personal life.
All right. Well, thank you for having me and really appreciate you doing this, Jeff. And I appreciate those of you that are out there listening. So I actually grew up here in Raleigh, North Carolina, which is the location of NC State University. It's the capital of the state, and I went to high school here. When I was in high school, I really enjoyed science and math, which had a big influence on the ultimate career path that I took. But I had other interests while I was in high school. I've always been interested in history and also played sports. I played soccer in high school and a few other sports, and I was also into music. I played guitar in a band and was really just involved with a whole bunch of different things. But ultimately, in terms of my careers, it was the science and math that I was best at and I was really excited about, but I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. I knew that I enjoyed helping other people in terms of like kind of tutoring them and teaching them on their homework, and teaching them concepts from class. So it was just something that I was leaning towards to ultimately become a teacher or a professor. But while I was in high school, I had the opportunity to take a tour of a clean room, which is like the facilities that places like Intel use to make computer chips. And I was really excited to learn that they use chemical processes to make computer chips. People usually think computer chips are electronics, but in terms of actually making the chips, it's all done by chemical processing. So that had a big influence on me. And so when I went off to college, I decided to major in chemical engineering, partly because of that experience and also just because I liked math and science. But I did have other interests, and it wasn't the only thing that I considered, but in the end, it seemed to be the right decision. After I graduated from college with a chemical engineering degree, I knew that I wanted to go to graduate school, and ultimately become a professor. But I felt like the best professors and teachers that I had along the way had some sort of practical work experience. So I went off to work at Merck, which is a pharmaceutical company. It's basically making drugs to help make people's lives better. And I worked there for a couple years and then went to grad school, as you mentioned, at the University of Texas, where I also studied chemical engineering. And I'll tell you maybe in a little bit here about the research I did. And then I did a postdoc, which is sort of just getting additional experience with research. And I did that at Harvard in Boston. And then in 2008, I started at NC State, and I've been here since then. It's been a really great time.
All right, Michael, thanks for that great overview and insights. And so it sounds like you had the vision of going for chemical engineering all the way back in high school. And so if you think about the audience as being juniors, seniors in high school, and looking at all the different types of STEM degrees out there, and I'm going to say that there's in the chemistry realm, some students really enjoy chemistry. So they're like, oh, I'll go for and be a chemist. And then there's also the option to be a chemical engineer. Can you help STEM Nation understand kind of what the differences between those two are?
I can try. So a chemist, they're mostly involved with coming up with reactions, for example, or just understanding molecules at a very fundamental level. So it's making new materials, getting things to react. And whereas a chemical engineer is more interested about, say, processes. So I can give you just an example from my own life. So when I worked at Merck, which I mentioned is a pharmaceutical company, the chemist would say, would work with biologists and say, well, here's a molecule that we want to make. And they would draw it on the board, and they would figure out what reactions do we need to use to make this, and they would kind of explore that and ultimately come up with a process. And then they would hand it to us, which is the chemical engineers, and we would basically try to figure out how to do it at larger scales so that we could make enough of this stuff And we had to know enough chemistry to be able to talk to them, but ultimately they came up with the chemistry, the chemical reactions, and we would be the ones that would make it on a larger scale. So this is maybe not a perfect analogy, but it's a little bit like if you were a cook, maybe, if you're a chef, you might come up with a recipe, but then when it comes to cooking for 100 people at a wedding or 1,000 people or something like that, there's new challenges that are involved, and that's where the chemical engineers come in. Um, and I think maybe if I explain it that way, maybe it's relatable, but maybe it sounds a little bit mundane. I think what makes chemical engineers really an exciting field, and I'm biased, but I think it's one of the best, is that we seek to understand the world all the way from the molecular level all the way to the macro scale. So, for example, we might understand how DNA works, or a reaction occurs, and that's all the way down at the molecule level. But we also study things like, how does blood pump through the body, or how do you pump oil from North Dakota down to Texas? How does that work? And these are very, very large length scales. So, kind of as a result of that understanding, that makes us very unique relative to the other engineers, and that enables us to do a whole lot of different things. So, currently, well, I'd say historically, chemical engineers have been working in things like oil, right? You dig, you put a shovel in the ground, and oil comes out. And how do you turn that into something valuable like gasoline or plastic or whatever? But more recently, in the last 50 years or so, chemical engineers are doing so many different things, from clean energy. I mentioned I worked on pharmaceuticals, nanotechnology, which is another thing that I'm kind of working on, computer chips, these kinds of things. And so because we can do so many different things, and pretty much all these things are chemical processes, there's kind of a reason chemical engineers tend to be the highest paid, and it's because they can do so many different things, and their skills are in demand. And that's not really the reason you should do it because of the pay, but it is nice to be compensated for what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. You got to make money doing what you enjoy, and that's
That's right.
and that's the beauty of a lot of these STEM degrees is you can make really good money and enjoy what you do.
Yeah, and you can make sorry to interrupt you, Jeff, but you can also make the world a better place. And I've found, at least with our students coming into our program, they're very interested in things like clean energy, the environment, and these kinds of things. And I hope that we are, the students, when they leave here, they're equipped with the skills to tackle some of those really challenging problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like your analogy that you used of the recipe. And that's what came to mind actually when you're describing that, as a chemist would be the one creating the recipe. So it almost feels like if you personally out in STEM Nation enjoy hanging out in the lab and just creating things and playing with things and seeing what you can develop, it sounds maybe like chemistry, maybe the way to go. And if you want to go in and productize it and make it at mass scale or at the macro level, then maybe chemical engineering. That might be dumbing it down a little bit too much, but that's kind of what came to my mind.
No, I think that's true, and that's kind of what I'm getting at when I say processes. It's in terms of picking the materials and the reactions and stuff. That's the chemists are sort of tinkering in the lab, but chemical engineers are trying to figure out how can we make this affordable and scalable and high throughput and those kinds of things. And like you said, it's a little bit oversimplification, and there's people that do all sorts of different things with chemical engineering degrees, but I think that at a very high level, that would sort of distinguish the two different degrees.
All right, sounds good. And I want to get into, on your LinkedIn page, liquid metal and stretchable electronics. Can you explain to STEM Nation what that means?
Sure, I can try. So right now, at least in the academic literature, there's a lot of interest in trying to make electronics that have new form factors. So if you think about your current electronics that you might have in your home or even in your pocket, there's things like cell phones and laptops, and these tend to be made out of rigid materials like silicon, for example. And so, but it's, if you want to dream a little bit, you start thinking about the human body, and our bodies have logic elements in the brain and memory in the brain, and we also have nerve networks for sensing, and these are all made from really soft and kind of squishy, stretchy materials. So that's a source of inspiration, and sort of the end goal is if you could make electronics have similar properties where they might, maybe have mechanical properties like a rubber band or something like that, then you can start putting them into places where they currently can't go. Maybe it's in clothing or some kind of device that could be worn on the body, or even an implantable device. So it's really driven by this idea of if you can impart new mechanical properties using materials, that you can maybe make new interesting type of devices.
So what would sorry for that. What would be an example of something like that?
Well, there's several examples. So there's some work that's being done putting electronics directly on the skin. So you imagine something like a temporary tattoo that kids like to put on their skin. So if you could make electronics that could go against the skin but be comfortable, so that you wouldn't even know that they were there. You could maybe have something like that when you go into the hospital, or for monitoring your vitals. Taking that to kind of an extreme, there's people that are taking those concepts and looking at them for devices that could go inside the brain for basically trying to understand diseases, or just trying to understand the way that the brain works by interfacing electronics with the brain. There's been some really interesting work on trying to help people that are paralyzed due to the back injuries. So if you can make electronics that help, if you break your back, that typically means you can't walk the rest of your life, because the signals from your brain aren't going to reach your legs. But if you can make soft and stretchy electronics that could help span like a break in your back, that could help transmit those signals. Those are a few examples. Kind of on the more near-term horizon, there's some really big companies like Samsung that have been looking at making foldable devices. So a device that, like a cell phone, that could go in your pocket, but you could kind of unfurl it and use it as a tablet for a bigger display. That's sort of more near-term. There's also been some interest in making devices like, say, that you could wear around your wrist, like a wristwatch, and then unfurl it and use it as a, more like a tablet or something like that. For a long time now, there's been interest also in trying to put these types of things into clothing, because, well, everybody wears clothing. And so, could you actually put electronics into the clothing? And there's some work, actually. Google has a partnership with Levi's right now that they're trying to do stuff like that. So it's a little bit of a situation where you can kind of let your imagination run wild about all the different things that you might be able to do.
Yeah, and it sounds like you're working with many, many other different types of teams like in the medical field, or in the clothing field, or it sounds like chemical engineering spans the gamut of pretty much all technology.
Yeah, so exactly. So in my particular case, the research that we're doing is very interdisciplinary. In fact, there's times where it's less chemical engineering, probably more material science, and there's some nuance there. But it's absolutely true that the work that we're doing involves collaborations. In fact, just today I've had meetings with Chemist. I had a meeting with an electrical engineer yesterday. And so whenever our expertise or knowledge falls short, we always reach out, and luckily there's a lot of great people here at the university that we can work with. But at its heart, I think there's elements of chemical engineering in what we do, in terms of the material that we're working with, which I didn't even really mention, is this liquid metal. And usually when people think of liquid metal, they think of mercury. In this case, it's based on gallium, which is just a material straight off of the periodic table. And we're studying the way that it reacts with air and also other materials, and using those reactions to basically control the shape of the material. Because most liquids, like water, for example, they tend to form droplets, but we want to be able to shape the metal and control the way it flows, so that we can make things like wires and antennas and other electronic structures to make it a little bit more useful.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I never really realized that is where chemical engineering could go. In my simple mind, I think of, petroleum. That's kind of where you think of chemical engineers, but not in all these different fields that you're working in. So, STEM Nation, if this is of interest to you, and it's like, wow, that is really exciting. I was chatting with Michael before we started the podcast, and he's all about helping people out. And so if you're in the North Carolina region, near NC State, go look him up on LinkedIn. His link will be in the show notes. And if you're not in NC State or North Carolina and Raleigh area, reach out to Michael on LinkedIn and connect with him and see what you can find out. See if that is really of interest to you. Start building out that network and start engaging with other folks, and then help hone where you want to go for your actual career.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to, if anybody's nearby, I would love to show them around our lab and show them the university. And even if they're not nearby, I'd be happy to talk on the phone or electronically via LinkedIn or just email.
Awesome. All right, so we're getting in here about 15 or so minutes in, and we're gonna pivot over to. I want to get into getting through college. For one, because Michael, right, you're a professor and you teach classes, so you see students coming through. You also had to get through the curriculum. And chemical engineering, at my understanding, it is not easy. I think it's one of the hardest ones. So let's go back to when you're 18, heading off into college. And what are some things that you wish you knew back then?
Well, I might take this in a slightly different direction than the spirit of your question, but when I was in high school, I'm not even sure why, but I think I've always had pretty good study habits. I was always self-motivated. So my parents never had to tell me to do my homework or anything like that. I just did it because that's just, I guess, how I was wired. So I didn't really have to make too many changes that way, or there's not too much I would change in that regard. But in terms of once I got to college, I think there was maybe a little bit of fear or anxiety about like having to create a resume that was competitive and that so that I'd be able to get into the graduate school that I wanted or get a job or whatever. And I think it's good to be mindful of that. But in my case, I took on a lot of activities that I enjoyed, but I wasn't all that passionate about. And so what I often tell my own students here at NC State is, just don't feel like you need to have every bullet point on your resume with a million different activities, but instead try to find 2 or 3 things or one thing that you feel really passionate about and try to go a little bit deeper. In other words, I would try to find a smaller number of things and do them really well and feel really good about it and have it be something you're excited about than to try to just, rack up bullet points on your resume, because life is too short. And at the end of the day, it's not the bullet points that you have on your resume, but it's the skills and the experiences that you have. And so kind of the more depth that you have, I think the better off you'll be.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And in moving into the students that you see coming through, what are some of the attributes that you see in the students that are very successful?
Well, the best students that I've seen are the ones who are sort of mature. They're self-starters, so they're just driven to do well, and they have good technical skills. So they have kind of a strong math background. Students who are curious do really well. So a lot of times they're the ones that would raise their hand in class or come and talk to you during office hours or that kind of thing. So, I would encourage students, I can't speak for every professor, but for me at least, I love it when students raise their hand and I love that kind of engagement. So showing that initiative is great. And then, over time hopefully through our program and through the students' experience, they will gain good communication skills, whether it be speaking and writing. When I was in high school, I was really happy to never take another English class.
I think that's pretty common.
And I think that's common. And I remember my teacher saying, "Oh, you're going to need this." And I would just a little bit roll my eyes and think like, "Okay, we'll see." And boy, were they right. And I'll do a lot of writing in my job. And so having that well-rounded education is important, even though I fought it for a long time. And then ultimately being able to work with others and work in teams is also important. But these are kind of things that you don't necessarily have to come into college with, but you will develop, hopefully, if you're in a good program, you'll develop that through your experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And Michael, we're going to go to the lightning round and then ask for a parting piece of guidance. So what is the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Well, I don't know if there's one piece of advice that, jumps out more than the others. I've gotten lots of good advice from people over the years, and I've been influenced by a whole lot of different great role models. But I think, the one thing that there was one thing that stands out, is just the value of hard work and dedication. I mean, there's just no replacing it. So that's one thing I would encourage students that are just getting started to kind of carry with them.
And a personal habit that contributes to your success.
I guess I would say that I try to follow the golden rule. That is that treat the others the way that you want to be treated, and don't forget that. And it sort of sounds like common sense, but that time and again has treated me well.
And a favorite internet resource or phone app?
Well, I don't use too many. I use WhatsApp, which I really like for keeping up with networks of friends, and occasionally I'll browse the news in a web browser. And lately I've been listening to podcasts, and I'll have to add STEMnation to this, but but I've been using Stitcher for that, and that's about it. I try not to use too many apps.
Yep. And a favorite book you would recommend?
Well, given the audience here, there was a book I read recently called The Disappearing Spoon, which, interestingly enough, is in reference to gallium, which is the liquid metal that we study in my lab. But that's not the reason it was interesting. It's a book that gives a history of the periodic table, and it does so in a very interesting way. I mean, it's a topic that certainly sounds like it could be very dry, but this is telling the backstory, the human story about how different elements were discovered, and I think if you're in the STEM field, and especially if you like chemistry, it really is a page turner and just fantastically put together.
All right, thanks for that. And that'll all be up in the show notes. And Michael, as we close down here, could you share a parting piece of guidance for STEMnation, and then we'll say goodbye?
Sure. Well, so for this one, I'm going to tell a little bit of a funny story. So when I was an undergrad, there was a professor who was retiring, and they did an exit interview with him. And in his exit interview, they said, well, what advice do you have for young people? And he said that he had a student in his class that was not doing so well, and he was not doing very well because he was a baseball player. So he was trying to balance baseball and chemical engineering. And his advice to that student was to give up baseball and instead focus on chemical engineering, because that was going to be his future. And he said, well, just yesterday, Mike Miller signed a $10 million contract with the Los Angeles Dodgers. And so he said, that's what he has to say about giving young people advice. So that sort of has stuck with me. And I think the takeaway from that is, if you find your passion, follow your gut and follow your instincts. And of course, that's not to say don't ignore other people's advice, because there is value in people who've had more years under their belt than you, but at the same time, take it with a grain of salt, and hopefully you can find something that you're passionate about and earn that $10 million contract yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, advice is good. You take it, you analyze it, and you determine whether or not you can take pieces of that advice or just disregard the advice altogether, right?
Exactly.
Right? Have to make your own decisions. Yeah, I was not offered any sort of $10 million baseball contract in my career.
I'm still waiting for mine too.
All right, Michael, and with that, we'll say goodbye, and thanks for being on.
Thank you so much.
All right. I hope you enjoyed that chat today with Michael. You can head over to STEMonfire.com, subscribe to the email list to keep up with the latest happenings, and be sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast player as we approach 20,000 downloads. Thanks, everybody, for listening. And with that, we will say goodbye.